Hi everyone. So I really enjoyed making the last X versus Y video, and I wanted to continue the series. Based on reading comments that were posted on that video, I thought it would be extremely interesting to zoom down a little to examine individual heroes rather than whole factions. So for this video, I'll be comparing the Warrior Priests of Sigmar against the Knights of the Silver Hand. Who will win? Stick around to find out.
Baby, don't you know it? I'm hardly heroic. Baby, let's roll it, 'cause I'm hardly heroic.
So, like in the previous video, I'm going to limit my scope in a number of ways. I'm only going to look at paladins as depicted in Warcraft 3 and the 8th edition Empire Army book for the Warrior Priests of Sigmar. I haven't played any of the MMOs, so I'm not even going to comment about that. But if you have, or you know more, please feel free to tell me about it and what I'm missing in the comments. I learned a lot about the Alliance post Warcraft 3 from last time. In terms of the scenarios, I will consider an individual duel between warrior priests and paladins, a skirmish between forces led by each respective hero, and a much larger battle where each might only be a single hero in a much larger force. So let's start with a bit of brief background on both heroes. Warrior Priests of Sigmar are priests from a militant wing of the cult of Sigmar. Sigmar is a war god from Warhammer Fantasy, and thus adherents of his faith are expected to serve on the battlefield, confronting the forces of evil, as well as ministering to the faith and well-being of his mortal followers. Clad in heavy armor and wielding the iconic hammer of their order, warrior priests can bolster the hearts of any faithful soldier against whatever horrors the old world can throw at them. By contrast, paladins in Warcraft are mostly members of the Order of the Knights of the Silver Hand. The Church of the Holy Light, one of the main Warcraft religions, founded the martial order in order to bring the power of the Holy Light to defend the faithful. The order had a prosperous reign under Uther the Lightbringer, but fell into ruin during the invasion of the Scourge. As you can see, both our heroes are members of a prominent religious martial society, and they're also very prominent users of hammers. So naturally, I think they would make for a great comparison. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So, starting off with something basic, the equipment of our heroes would be roughly comparable in my opinion. Warrior priests are traditionally armored in heavy armor, which in lore can range from anything from a full coat of mail armor all the way to basically full plate armor. Traditionally, warrior priests go unhelmeted with their heads shaven, but they are reasonably well protected, especially when you consider the other soldiers in the Empire Army. For their armaments, they are traditionally armed with either two hammers, a hammer and a shield, or a two-handed warhammer. Paladins are also relatively heavily armored in plate armor. Like warrior priests, they also go without helmets, which of course would be silly in reality, but these are fictional worlds we're talking about. Like warrior priests, they are armed with large two-handed hammers, but of course, in the game, Warcraft 3, we don't tend to see them armed with anything else. In terms of equipment, I would say that both sides are roughly comparable. Both paladins and warrior priests are very well armored, respective to most other foot soldiers. And they both make use of hammers, which, of course, in this context is very useful, because warhammers are very useful for dealing with armor. The concussive force of a warhammer can hurt someone even if they are wearing full plate. So it means that even though both of these users have relatively high levels of protection, they're both also normally armed with weapons that are useful for dealing in armor. Of course, warrior priests can make use of different types of hammers, and maybe you can argue or split hairs about the use of a shield or maybe two hammers, but really the differences aren't necessarily so large. In fact, I would argue that probably the two-handed hammer is the most common type of hammer that is associated with the warrior priests, and so it's not really that relevant to the comparison here to split the hairs over exactly which type of weapon would be used. More importantly, I think, in terms of the fighting prowess, I think both heroes have a roughly comparable level of skill and training. I know this might sound a bit contentious, but I think that both of our heroes are members of religious warrior orders that place a huge value on martial skill, especially of their members. While individual warrior priests or paladins might be quite skilled, I imagine that of course Uther the Lightbringer was very good with his hammer, and similarly Luther Huss is definitely a better example of a fighting warrior priest than most, but I think on aggregate, in general, both groups are just well trained at handling their weapons. I can't imagine that they would fumble the ball, so to speak, with handling their weapons or using their armor or anything like that. So I don't necessarily think we can give either side a decisive skill advantage. Again, individuals might be better or worse than others, but as a group, I think if you picked an average paladin or an average warrior priest, they would both have roughly the same level of skill and training. I think to some extent, you could always argue that one might have more experience than the other. Certainly, a warrior priest in Warhammer Fantasy might have to deal with far more frequent battles or engagements with the enemy than, say, for example, a paladin. But, on the other hand, you could always argue that paladins participated in some of their universe's most destructive, most important wars, and therefore their order retained a lot of experience from that. I don't want to split those hairs either way, so I'm just going to say that they both have a roughly equal ability in terms of armaments, in terms of fighting skill, and in terms of training. It's in the abilities of our two heroes that I think we have far more significant differences. Paladins in Warcraft 3 have 4 basic abilities. Holy Light, which is an individual heal, although it does do about half damage to an undead character. Divine Shield, which stops all damage for a short amount of time. Devotion Aura, which increases the armor of nearby units. And of course Resurrection, the ultimate, which is a powerful spell that resurrects up to 6 dead friendly nearby units. By contrast, warrior priests only have 2 abilities, Battle Prayers and Righteous Fury. The latter is kind of a passive ability that allows the warrior priest and the unit that he's in to re-roll their hits against an enemy target for the first round of its battle. The former is much more comparable to paladin spells. Battle Prayers are a type of bound spell, which means that they're not necessarily strictly spells in the Warhammer Fantasy sense, but they are for all other purposes treated as spells. And these are things that can affect the warrior priest and also, importantly, the unit that he is attached to. Unit attachments is a very important part of Warhammer, so generally speaking, except for few exceptional cases, you won't have a hero not attached to a unit serving as part of that unit over the course of battle. It's just, generally speaking, not wise to do that unless you have a particular case, like for example an engineer who is tending to war machines, or a particularly good assassin character, or maybe a hero who's riding on some kind of ferocious beast that justifies the need for him to not be protected by more baseline units. But, importantly, one of the quirks of the warrior priest spells is that if the unit that the priest is attached to is a regimental unit, i.e. part of the regimental system of the Empire, then all of the detachments, which are smaller units that are attached to the regimental unit, those units are also affected by any spell if they're near enough to the parent unit when that spell is cast. So for example, if the warrior priest is attached to a unit of Empire Spearmen, and those spearmen have a detachment, say for example handgunners or crossbows, if those crossbowmen are close enough to the spearman unit, when the priest casts his spell, they will be affected as well, which dramatically increases the potential for the coverage of the priest's spells. In terms of spells, warrior priests have 3. Hammer of Sigmar, which grants rerolls to wounds, which we can imagine would basically make it easier for somebody to actually hurt someone. Shield of Faith, which is kind of like Divine Shield, except it grants a 5+ ward save. And Soulfire, which gives the unit that the priest is attached to, plus himself of course, flaming attacks. And it also does holy fire damage to undead and demonic units that are in base contact with the priest when the spell goes off. Of course, it's somewhat difficult to translate these 2 abilities from 2 very different game systems, but I'll try to think of it as a roughly comparable system by looking at a maybe higher level of utility. I think that the outcome, actually, of this comparison almost depends entirely on the abilities of the units and the context in which they're used. Okay, so the Paladin and Warrior Priest are actually put into the matchup. They're very similar in their armaments and armor, so I don't think that's going to be decisive either way. The fact that they both also don't wear helmets probably would result in a lot of people getting brained to death, but that's another tangent for another time. In reality, who is better depends a lot, I think, on the abilities that they have and the specific context in which those abilities will be used. So let's start with the solo duel. I think the Paladin would easily be able to win duels with the Warrior Priest in most cases, and the reason for that is simply they have access to the Divine Shield spell. The ability to negate all damage, magical or otherwise, for even 15 seconds will be enough to allow the Paladin to land a critical hit on the Warrior Priest before the Warrior Priest could even land something of their own. 15 seconds in a fight can make or break that fight entirely. So the fact that the Paladin can cancel damage in that way is extremely good. A 5+ ward save is a somewhat comparable kind of magical protection for the Warrior Priest, but the problem is, at least in Warhammer terms, a 5+ ward save is a 1 in 3 chance to negate any kind of damage that comes in, but the Divine Shield negates all damage. Granted, it's only for 15 seconds, but in a make or break duel, 15 seconds can make the difference between life or death. In the cases where the paladin doesn't have access to Divine Shield, maybe the mana cost is too high, or maybe they've already used it and it's on cooldown or anything like that, then I think it's probably a question of the individual paladin and the warrior skill level. Paladins can't heal themselves, so that ability is out. The Devotion Aura might be a little bit useful, but as I said, both of the sides are roughly equal in terms of their equipment. So really, if the Paladin doesn't have access to what I think is their game-changing spell, Divine Shield, who wins really just depends on the individual skill level of the Warrior Priest and the Paladin in question. Yes, I think the Warrior Priest will have a lot of zeal, especially to attack perhaps maybe an enemy warrior of an enemy faith, but of course, whether or not they win really depends on how actually good they are as a fighter, and that can be very variable. So I think we should probably move on to maybe higher level of combat, and in that case that would be the small skirmish. By small skirmish I mean a small battle, but perhaps maybe fewer than a dozen troops on both sides, that is between common troops in both factions. So we can imagine that maybe a paladin is leading a patrol of footmen and dwarven riflemen, and maybe they bump into a warrior priest who's also leading a patrol of, say, Empire State troops with halberds and handguns or whatever you have, right? The point is to examine the utility and the power of these heroes in a context of a skirmish. Not necessarily who would win including the skirmish, but rather to consider their utility and usefulness in a broader sense. So in this context, I think the Paladin is again probably going to triumph. While the Divine Shield is less useful as a spell when you start to zoom out a little bit, the Paladin can still heal their troops, whereas the Warrior Priest has no heal. So the fact that the Paladin can heal troops for, generally speaking, a lot of health, that probably is not a good thing, especially for the Warrior Priest who has no heal of their own. The nail of the coffin, I think, however, is the Resurrection spell. Even if the Imperial troops win the battle, provided the Paladin is alive and able to cast the Resurrection spell, that means that they will be able to revive up to 6 dead soldiers for a round 2, whereas the battered Empire troops will likely not be able to do that. And therefore, in terms of longevity, the Paladin adds an enormous amount of value to his side as opposed to the Warrior Priest, which possibly could help, especially in the first charge, with the Hatred special rule that he can give. So, while a Warrior Priest does have a lot of boosts to give to their units, I don't think those abilities are going to be overcome by the longevity provided by the Paladins, because in skirmishes, especially small skirmishes, whoever wins is usually the side who can last longer, and the ability to heal units plus also prevent himself from being damaged, plus also the ability to resurrect any dead units, grants an enormous amount of utility to the Paladin side, and therefore I think that the Paladin is probably going to win the skirmish, or at least his side will win the skirmish more times than the side of the Warrior Priest. Although, of course, Warriors of Sigmar will definitely give it a go. Finally, when we look at a larger battle, when we zoom out as far as we possibly can, there's where I think things are not so good for the Paladin. Sure, a single heal is very important, and if you're one of those 6 soldiers who gets resurrected, I think your day is going to be made, but in a large battle with dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of soldiers, well, this is where, in my opinion, the Paladins are swiftly outclassed by the Warrior Priests. The reason being is that the Warrior Priest's abilities and spells scale really well with the size of their units. That is, their abilities affect the entire unit regardless of its size. A 5+ ward save on a unit of, say, 10 soldiers is okay, that can add a lot to their toughness and to their durability, but a 5+ ward save on a unit of 50 soldiers is massive. This greatly increases the survivability of that unit and makes it much more likely that the unit will actually live in combat. This allows Warrior Priests to provide huge utilities to massive numbers of soldiers that can be decisive, especially when, of course, we're talking about large units in fights. The Paladins are useful, but the powers don't really scale well outside of smaller skirmish-type battles, so I think this gives Warrior Priests a very decisive edge in this particular case. If we're looking at large-scale battles, you really want to have a large number of Warrior Priests distributed across your army, and those guys can really provide you a lot of benefits that could greatly enhance your army's survivability, its toughness, its ability to do damage against the enemy, as well as, of course, giving each individual unit a powerful leader that can potentially help them against, certain kinds of situations like duels with enemy heroes. Whereas Paladins don't really scale that well. And of course, it's quite telling that in Warcraft 3, you can only have one Paladin on the battlefield at a time, as opposed to, say, for example, an Empire army, which can have many Warrior Priests distributed across the entire line. And of course, if you really have the points, well, then you can bring an Arch-Lector, who is like a Warrior Priest, but even better at providing buffs and bonuses to units around him. Okay, so in conclusion, there you have it. The Paladin beats the Warrior Priest in 2 out of our 3 scenarios, which I think makes perfect sense. Since Warcraft 3 is a very small scale kind of game, it's really not a real-time strategy. I've heard it described as a real-time role-playing game, and that totally makes sense. Battles are rarely larger than a few dozen units at most. The paladin's abilities are actually perfect, almost as if they were designed for this particular context, but the paladin's abilities are really perfect for this kind of battle, where they can swing the course of a fight decisively by affecting maybe 1 or 2 units, or perhaps, at most at 6. However, when we zoom out, when you look at a mass combat situation, that's when paladin abilities really start to lag behind a warrior priest. And of course, this again makes sense because warrior priests were designed for a mass combat game. They have abilities that are tremendously useful for different types of large-scale engagements. And if you've never put a warrior priest in a block of like 40 greatswords, you've never really played an Empire army, in my opinion. So, I am biased. Warrior priests are literally one of my favorite units in Warhammer Fantasy, and I love them to death. I have more than a few in my army as it stands. But I have to admit, and I have to say this, but the paladins deserve the win today. I think that really, for most applications, you really would want to actually have a paladin over a warrior priest. As for who I think looks cooler, I think I would probably have to give the win to the warrior priests. I think that paladin armor kind of looks a little bit silly. Certainly some of it is a little bit better designed, but that's just a matter of personal preference. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like or maybe a share. Subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Let me know if you have any ideas or would like to see any comparisons in the comments below. Merry Christmas and have a Happy New Year!